Okay, this is webinar number 7 with group 2. And this week we're talking about disabilities. Our first question, what are factors associated with why students of color are disproportionately identified for special education?
I think the Ford article had a pretty succinct summary because a lot of them were pretty in-depth, but she said it's attitudes, expectations, and testing. And it seems like everything we read fell into those categories. Mm-hmm. The one that was kind of helpful for me was the Anama, Morrison, and Jackson, where they talked about racism and ableism being normal occurrences. So if you look at it as that's the default, that we're dealing with racism and ableism, then like anything that's, as she quotes, neutral is going to be founded in those. And so everything is being filtered through normative standards of white and able-bodied. And so that was fairly, that one kind of clicked for me.
Yeah. And Laura, that kind of connects, I don't know if it was technically this module or the next one, but the Waking Up White reading where she talked about how you can't just be a bystander, because by being neutral, you're taking a side and you're kind of perpetuating the problem. So the fact that these neutral policies that we still technically have in place are really still managing those students of color.
Mm-hmm.
What got me was how it all started because we did to segregate the schools, and so this was their way of getting rid of them and having them try to expel them, try to get them away from the white kids. So to me, that's how it started, and then it seems like it just is just never has gone away. And then we started that stigma, all because that was our way of trying, well, I say our way, but that was their way of trying to go against the law of segregating schools or desegregating.
And that made me wonder, like, what's going to be the next one? Because we know, like, read the paper, this hasn't gone away.
Yes.
Like, and so now that we're working on the special education side of that, what's going to be the next way? And now that a lot of schools are doing restorative justice, what's the next way we're going to be splitting kids?
Right. So that's a very good point. Okay. All right. So next question says, what federal policies have shaped the educational experiences of students with this or disabilities in terms of justice and the law? The big one for me, of course, is IDEA.
Yeah.
That's what I work with every day, and it's a really important program in that it makes us accountable to those children with different abilities, and you can't just sweep them under the rug if you're doing it right. It's not perfect, but it's what we have to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that you can continue.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I thought the same thing, that IDEA is the big one that I remember hearing about in undergrad, and I think reading more about it, I think that that's kind of the biggest one because it is so specific and gives so many regulations and rules about what you do for students with IEPs. And it's the accountability factor as well, that schools and educators have to be accountable for it, so that program makes sure that that's in place.
Right, and the portion of it that calls for the FAPE, the free and appropriate public education, is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Because, Ansley, you were talking about different ways of segregating and desegregating kids, and before it was required that you give these children, that all children get that free, appropriate public education, you could legally stick the disabled kids in a room by themselves and say, oh, they're at school, it's all good.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not an appropriate public education, and we're being held to that standard now, whether it's high or low, but it's still, at least there's something in place.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk to parents, when I'm going through the initial referral process, I tell them it's not like it was when you used to watch the old movies and see what happened to these kids. That's not how it is. Mm-hmm. These kids are treated like every other kid, at least in where I work, every other kid in our school. They have the same rights and obligations.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. I do think it's really interesting that they talk about how there's a lot of like ambiguity even within the legislation and like how things are defined. Like the biggest one was like the least restrictive environment. Like,
Right.
there's still so much that's left up to individual interpretation, and most people probably are doing everything they can to make sure that they're going above and beyond, you know, what it specifically says. But it talks about how like sometimes like the definitions for terms, like everything is kind of still so ambiguous that that's not something I realized was part of the.
Right, and that's where you get to the importance of the IEP team. Not just one person or just the administrator or just the teacher putting a child in special ed, if you will. It's a whole team, and everybody needs to be involved to make sure that child's getting what they need.
Yeah. To Becca's point on the ambiguity, the Discrit article, the disability critique one, was really interesting in terms of that. And I have a friend who's just finishing up her doctorate, and like that's most of what she does is Discrit stuff. And so we've gotten to talk a few times about that ambiguity thing, but like that the line they drew there between like subjectively defined types of disability and medically defined types of disability. And I don't think I have, I'm looking for the quote, but that was a really interesting thing to me, that like that it's that different, and that can be the line between a kid being placed where they don't need to be and a kid being placed where they do. So like IDEA does not differentiate between medically defined and other. Like it doesn't establish the categories and the benchmarks and the evaluative processes and that kind of stuff, which, I mean, the more you specify in legislation, the less you can deal with each kid on a kid-by-kid basis, so I get that. But not having any definition of, like, even what line is going to split where you define categories, that was really interesting.
All right, anything else on that one? All right, we shall move on. Question 3. What are the different special education categories that educators should be aware of, and what are the differences between them? Well, one of the things you were talking about, Laura, was the subjective versus medical, if you will, categories. Legally, I have to place a kid in a category, but that doesn't mean that I have to treat those kids differently based on their category. My job as a special ed teacher is to make sure that each child gets an individualized education program. And I tell my parents, it doesn't matter whether your child is labeled as learning disabled or intellectually disabled or autistic. They're going to get the treatment that the help that they need. But you know, it is important to be aware of those categories and not pigeonhole kids into them. I know I'm talking a lot, but I have a student who just went on to 6th grade who was labeled as intellectually disabled because her IQ was in the 70s. This child is made honor roll, AB honor roll all through elementary school. She has to work a lot harder than the other kids, but looking at that one number is not the way we define a child.
And I think it was the article that talked about the least restrictive environment. I think that kind of creates categories as well with special ed. I work in high school, so I only see certain categories in that aspect because we have like a high intensive resource room where the students are there all day, every day. And then we also have the students who are in all normal classes, but then they'll have one class a day with their sped teacher. So I think that the least restrictive environment like kind of creates more categories as well of what it is that the education looks like for each individual kid.
That's interesting.
And for me, I feel like I'm going to go against the grain. I like the labels at a point, just because like coming in, I would like I've had the kids that are emotionally disturbed. I've had a kid that was diagnosed psychotic and, autistic and all those different things. So for me, it's not that I pigeonhole them like you were saying, but it's nice to know them. So at least I can already make accommodations before they come in, and I can be aware of it. So if I'm aware, then like say my emotionally disturbed, I know things that triggered him. So it's nice to know, so you can try to avoid those situations. But yet again, like you're saying, just because they have learning disabilities doesn't mean they can't do anything. But it's nice for me as the teacher to know in my class I have 4 different IEPs or 4 different kids, and so I can figure out my lessons and things like that. So I feel like labeling, there is pros and cons to it as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know that if you have a child with autism coming in, you might want to set up a left to right system or a finished box. So you can be ready for that, knowing, of course, that each child is going to be different. And, but yeah, I'm not saying that the labels are bad. I'm just saying that they're not the be all end all.
Right.
And it would be nice if they told us more, if they were more useful.
Ansley, kind of to your point about the labels having pros and cons, they talked a lot about, the article talked about like the impacts that has on students. When I was younger, I had a lot of like speech problems. I mean, like most young children do. I called myself Rebecca. I couldn't say ours. Yeah, I know, it's adorable. But it got to the point where teachers in school were like, she probably might need to be in speech classes. And they did. They kind of threw out, like, do we want to put her on an IEP? And my mom was like, I don't think she needs this. So just kind of like that personal experience of like potentially being labeled like special ed. I mean, and I received, like speech services through the school, but just that again, like personal, like my mom's like, I don't know if I want her to have that label. And now I think we've come so far, even in, 10 or 15 years, that now the labels are more beneficial than some people see them as being cons. But
yeah. And I was labeled twice exceptional in school too. Like they figured out the ADD thing in first grade, and a lot of places it's really hard to get into the tag program if you're receiving special ed services. And so they did not have me getting special ed services, but the counselor was like a genius in elementary and was able to do like weave in support stuff without putting me on that track so that I would still be eligible for the gifted and talented track later on. And like, so I got pull out advanced math classes and remedial math support in elementary. And like, that's really hard to swing. The only reason they were able to pull that off is because my mom is, frankly, white middle-aged lady in charge. Worked from home at that point, and was able to volunteer in the school 20 hours a week. So she had enough credit to burn, enough capital, cultural capital to burn to be able to say, no, my kid's gonna get both versions. Like, how many parents and families are in that position? The only reason is because my mom is a writer and has a lot of cultural capital. That's the only reason that I was eligible for that.
Yeah, we've got that 1 minute left.
Okay.
So.
Or how crazy, again, that there's kind of this like separation between like, you can't be gifted but also need special education services. Like, I think that's an issue in and of itself with that. Like, they're bored in class, and that article's talking about that. They're bored, so maybe they act out or they're defiant when they get labeled as special ed, when really they need gifted. So that, again, that kind of dichotomy of like, you can't be both. Why can't you be both?
Right. A lot of kids are somewhere in that. Like, I could not multiply to save my life, but I could do algebra in like 3rd or 4th grade. Like, would I be a math teacher if I hadn't been able to advance while catching up?
Right.
Ooh, that's probably not. But I am a math teacher, and I'm a good one. Like, and I can help the kids who are missing that stuff because I've had both.
Okay, we can go ahead and move on with question 4. I think we covered 3 pretty well. Question 4 says, what role do educators play in how students are identified for special education and the types of services they may or may not receive?
I thought this one was really interesting because it was talked about in multiple articles that whenever teachers are the ones who are referring kids, that you have to look at implicit biases and unconscious bias, because if whatever the statistic is, like 85% of teachers are middle-class white women, and we've already seen how that affects things in the classroom and how there's a disconnect there, that can't be the only person, like the gatekeeper to all of this stuff. And one of the articles said that like it's a crazy statistic about how the only thing that helps Black children get into gifted programs and things like that is if they have a Black teacher, and that's the only difference they can find across the board.
Yeah, that made me sad.
Mm-hmm. There was a quote too, just real quick, that said basically it was the same test scores, the same everything, but the name was one that was associated with low income or minority. They wouldn't be recommended. That just blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How many of you work in schools where there's more than one Black teacher?
Well, majority, we're half and half, but I'm international. But
right,
our director is American.
I do, but my school is 76% minority, so they work really hard at admin and teachers representation. So we're in a weird one. How about you guys?
Yeah.
I'm the only Hispanic teacher in our school, and all the rest are white women.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm in rural North Carolina. You know, that's what lives here.
Yeah, we have we have 2 Black teachers this year, but what's actually cool and relevant to this is that one of them is now the SPED department head, and she's mostly in charge of the kids with behavior issues. So it's kind of interesting that is the one Black teacher we have, because she's like making a huge impact in the area that she's in.
That's awesome.
We don't have many Black teachers, but we have a lot of like not like building admin, but district admin. Like we have an equity like admin person who's a man of color. Like we have a couple of people of color who are kind of in more system-based involvement stuff. But yeah, so the kids don't see it. You know, they're not in the building on a regular basis. But yeah, it's a good question, Laura, because it's not something I thought about. But
yeah, that is a good question.
That's interesting to see in terms of looking at your kids, who's been identified as what, and how much representation is in the decision-making body.
Right. One of the most, for all of you guys as regular education teachers, the most important thing that I see is communication with the parents and with your special ed teacher. Mm-hmm. Talk with them so you can call them. Don't think that just because they're the special ed teacher, they're just down in this little room at the other part of the school and nobody has to pay attention to them. They've got a lot of resources, y'all. Talk to them. Okay.
Piggybacking off of,
Go, Ansley.
I went and found what Rebecca was saying about them having the same scores, and it used the word that if they would be suspicious of the Black child if he had the same scores as the white child, and it just like that got to me because I was like suspicious of what? He's cheating, or he can't be cheating. Like, what are you suspicious of him for? For having the same scores? Like, it blew my mind.
Right. Yeah.
But like very humbling. There was a kid this year who I had in class, and again, when you have a kid for a whole year, you know more than you know about him. But a kid who struggled, in math, and then on his final, it was like actual math. And again, like he was Hispanic, and thinking back, I was like, this seems weird. Like, and again, but he was in like a support class too, and I talked to that teacher, and we like agreed that like, no, this was like his thinking. But again, like I've done that of like, this doesn't seem like scores that he should be getting. And was that somehow unconsciously because of his race? Maybe, I don't know. But when I read that, I was like, oh, how sad. Like, but wait, I think I've done that. Which, I mean, isn't great, but we're here to learn.
Right. But you're seeing it.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the point of this class, is to learn to see that.
Yeah.
To open ourselves up to those revelations.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Question 5 then. What should educators know about the experience of students of color who are misidentified for special education?
The one subject that was kind of eye-opening for me that goes with this question was the talk about students being overrepresented in speech and language specifically. That was something that I thought was so interesting, was that it's like ELL students and Black students. Like, no wonder people listen to them talk and say, oh, you have a speech problem, you need to be in this class. That was just one specific area that I thought was so interesting and sad that there was also overrepresentation in that area specifically. That makes sense, that if you have all of these biases and things, if you hear somebody speak or if you don't understand the behavior that you're saying because it's a cultural thing or a language thing, that would definitely be, I don't know, it would like explain why these students are placed in these classes that they shouldn't be in.
Mm-hmm. I know sometimes I've had like English language learners in the room, and like if I have to like remember that, like Anne's remembering the label so you know who to help when, but like I've had to kind of filter out how I'm processing their noise level, because sometimes they're literally just asking the person next to them for a different word for what I said.
Right.
Like, they're not talking over me, they're not disrupting, they're asking for clarification because they missed a word. Or they missed a phrase and they couldn't translate it back. Like, don't punish that talking in class. Mm-hmm. They are trying to learn. But, like, changing how you filter that, because, like, especially as a first-year teacher, that was something I jumped on.
Well, yeah. That's just like the Waking Up White. There's, again, I know I went ahead and just finished it, so I don't know if technically it's the next module or not, but there was a scenario where there was a little girl who kept getting up to go across the room, and she kept being like, you have to stay in your seat, you have to stay in your seat. And all the girl was doing was helping. She said, I heard the other kids say, I don't understand this, and I wanted to help. But it was like, until they had that conversation of like, why are you always up and out of your seat? And like, again, you don't understand. So I feel like the assumption sometimes is for teachers to assume the worst, when really we should be assuming the best in kids. So sorry if I spoiled a section of the book.
No, that goes back to that cultural competence that they were talking about. You know, I found it really interesting the learning characteristics they listed of the African American students and how those can be misinterpreted, especially like you said, the up and down and the voice modulation and stuff. And as a typical Black teacher, you think about ADD or a speech problem, and it's like, no, that's just the way that these kids learn.
Mm-hmm. I had a accommodation in elementary and I think middle that I could get up and leave for 3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah, a lot of my
kids, I had to be up every like 25 or 30 until I figured out how to cope with it. And
a lot of my students have that written into their IEPs. It's like they can walk around the room. It's okay.
It's so small.
Yes.
Another thing, or with this, I feel like a lot of the articles we're talking about, not just in this module, but talking about preschool, and like if they don't go to preschool, then when they go to kindergarten, they're already behind.
Right.
And I think that goes with being misidentified also. I don't feel like they're behind. They might be behind, but that doesn't mean that they have a learning disability. They just might be a little bit slower. Like, for instance, I'll go real quick. I had a student who I had gotten, and he was on an IEP, and he was ELL because Arabic's the only thing his parents speak. And he came to me, and after like first testing, I was like, I didn't understand why he was on the IEP at all. And then the first conference, mom comes in, the boy's in there, and Muhammad starts crying. Because all I was saying was how great he was doing, and he's crying, mom's crying, because apparently all in the last 2 years, his second and third grade year, they talked about, we're going to kick him out of the school. He's not smart. He's not going to make it. And he's crying because here I am saying, and I had no idea, opposite of what and he ended up getting off an IEP, and that just makes me think that these kids, we're identifying them just because they're a little bit slower does not mean that they all of a sudden have a learning disability. They're just a little bit slower, and sometimes he didn't go to pre-K, so he's just working really hard just to catch up. Sometimes it's just a catch up. And I think that teachers need to realize that instead of saying your kid's not smart. And unfortunately, some teachers do say that. Like, you have to look at the kid as an individual, like it's all same. And you have to look at his background. He's coming from a family, they don't speak English at all. I have to have a translator when they're there. And so it just goes with the kid. You have to look at their experience and just go back, what is their home life like? And are they really supposed to be in special ed? Or are they just trying to catch up? Or are they just a little bit slower?
It goes back to that education debt that Ladson Billings was writing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left, y'all, so I'm going to jump into these last 2 questions, which fit together. Question 6 says, what factors impact the under-identification of students of color for gifted education? And then question 7 is, what can educators do to address the under-identification of students of color for gifted education? So those pretty much tie together. And Ansley, I think what you were just saying is that cultural difference leads to a lot of that under-identification, because Muhammad could very well have moved on to a gifted program once he had a teacher who took the time to look at the whole student.
And Casey, this is kind of your area, right?
Well, so I'm a regular classroom teacher, but just the building that I'm in, I teach an advanced class, and so I have a lot of gifted students. So with students of color not being referred as much as they should, there was a lot of, like, I see that in my own classroom. Like, I haven't had any students of color with a gifted IEP at all, which is ridiculous. But so then I was just really interested reading everything this week about this gifted stuff and like why students of color aren't represented like they should be. So one of the things I thought was interesting was in the Ford video, and she talked about how parents who either are low income or who don't have educational experience themselves can't advocate, kind of like what you were talking about, Laura, can't advocate for their kids to be tested for gifted and push the school to do it and things like that. So parent experiences definitely play into that, because it's the more rich kids whose parents were gifted themselves who can go to the school and say, test my kid, I'm not happy with this, you need to do that. So I thought that was one of the things. So it's kind of sad. And then also, just a little side note, thinking about what the school offers. I'm in a really big affluent suburban area. We have so many AP classes that are offered, and like our gifted program is awesome and stuff. That is not the same whatsoever for the poor inner city schools that have a majority population of students of color. So with schools kind of being segregated today, it's also those programs and money and things is totally different as well.
My last school had a specific category for white parents pushing their kids into the gifted category. They had a special designation. It was because they had codes for types of giftedness, and there was a W.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And so you were just to ignore that.
Oh.
Well, I mean, and I think for what can educators do too, I think it's helping students realize the opportunities they have. Like some kids, like for math, they don't know that they can take geometry and algebra 2 in the same year. Well,
right.
The white middle class kids do. They sign up, even though they maybe shouldn't. So just helping them realize that. And then the one thing I found interesting was the earlier you can identify them, the better. Because Ford talked about like the atrophy, like you don't use it, you lose it. And by the time they get to high school, a lot of students of color feel like they have this persona to kind of stick to. She also talked about helping them see that achievement doesn't mean acting white. So those are just 2 things I found interesting.